Can everyone hear me all right? Is it being properly mic'd and such? It's not very loud? Okay. I think it's on. Well, I'll use this. I want to make sure it actually gets captured for the online thing. Let me see here. Does this work? All right. Let's try this. How about that? Okay. Good. Thank you for inviting me. I think Derek was being very generous when he called me the creator of Apache, and I know that often does get out there that way as well. Really what I did at that point in time was more of a cattle herder. There was a lot of interest and activity in extending some of the basic technologies around it at the time for this new thing called the web back then, and my role was to pull a group of people together and get them to think about combining their patches and their improvements to a pre-existing web server put out by a research group and combine them into something that corporations could use for some of the first websites out there. And then later on in that was 95, 98 is when we realized that there were so many people using it that the risk that a patent holder out there might decide to sue us as individual developers for using something they had claimed to have invented that we had no idea of. If that were to happen, that would be a problem, and we'd rather not lose our homes and mortgages, for the crime of giving away free software. So we created a nonprofit called the Apache Software Foundation, and in my spare time, I was president of that for its first 3 years, and on its board for its first 6. I'm also currently on the board of the Mozilla Foundation, and I won't go into too much depth on that, but the foundation is a small group, but it's actually the parent of the Mozilla Corporation, and the corporation is what employs a lot of the programmers and the marketing types, and we can talk about marketing in a bit because I know that came up in a prior session, who go out there and promote Firefox and Thunderbird and these other technologies. And again, that's more spare time. My full-time job from 99 when I started it until actually just the end of March when I retired in a way was as founder and CTO of CollabNet. And as Derek mentioned, it really was to figure out how to take a lot of the economic, or the activity, you could say, and the way that people organize themselves into projects and build software, in a very distributed way, and replicate that, turn it into a science, make it repeatable, and take it into corporations, to address the 90% of other software developers who don't write software to sell, but instead write software to use internally. And so I'm actually right now kind of taking some time off and thinking about what to do next, but traveling and speaking is something I love doing, and so I'm very thankful to Derek and to others here for allowing me to come and speak. Before I really dive into the idea of what is it that running an open source business is really about, I wanted to kind of set a context for something, which is to say that there's this debate within the open source community quite a bit about altruism versus capitalism, right? And this is a debate that goes back before open source software, and certainly at least as old as the internet was. The reason why we have TCP/IP and DNS and SMTP and all these other protocols that form the DNA for the internet was from the research that was conducted largely by universities and by research organizations during the 60s, 70s, 80s and such that were based on common protocols that no one claimed exclusive ownership of or licensed, but instead were built collaboratively and built upon the ideas that people had about the right way to build networks of networks and shared. And I was first introduced to the internet in 1991 as a freshman at University of California, Berkeley. And I started to discover email and Usenet and FTP sites and Gopher. And there was a very strong debate at that point in time over whether commercial sites and commercial organizations should be using the internet at all. Because, when the backbone was managed by the National Science Foundation and other groups like that, it was even questionable over, should we allow this to become corrupted by filthy lucre, right? And It was a soul-searching kind of existentialist moment for the internet. There were people who said, maybe we can bring business in on our terms. You know, we can make sure that the routing protocols value every packet no matter what its objective is, right? And gracefully, you know, corporations were able to get online. Even when AOL came on, and if anyone remembers at that point in time, the perpetual September, the phrase to describe, you know, newbies, you know, jumping onto lists and flooding it with silly questions. We've been able to survive all that. The Internet's core architecture and the culture that was built around that was able to survive it. Even within Apache. In '95, as I mentioned when we started that project, I was kind of straddling two jobs. I was the chief engineer at Wired magazine and its first online initiative called Hotwired, which was kind of one of the first ad-supported sites. And I was also, this being San Francisco, this being a really advertising and media-focused kind of city, I had started a company with a couple of other people called Organic, which built websites wanted to build websites for, at that time, publishers, record labels, that kind of thing, and gradually came to build sites for, you know, companies like Harley Davidson, Levi's, Nike, you know, McDonald's, McDonald's.com, kind of funnily enough. And these were, you know, again, we straddled that line between bringing commercial organizations onto the net and doing that in a responsible way. And so my work on Apache, which was in the form of trying to kind of herd a lot of this activity towards let's get a release out, let's choose the best of the patches out there, I was not the only one doing that for commercial reasons. Other participants were there because they were webmasters at Amazon or at the Internet Movie Database. They were, you know, students who were managing the web presence for MIT. There were a couple of people there for that reason. There was and a lot of people who ran internet service providers who were, you know, building mom and pop websites, right? And there were a few people there for the pure love and the thrill of seeing how fast can we, you know, how many million hits per hour can we get this lowly, you know, 486 box to pump out, right? You know, there's kind of an intellectual thrill to that. But, you know, the only sites that need that kind of performance were porn sites. So everyone else was kind of like, what can we do with this to actually, you know, make money and make it useful for those of us doing things externally? And so this question of altruism versus capitalism, for the generation who got on the net in the early 90s and mid-90s was kind of a defining moment, that maybe there's a way to synthesize this. And I remember growing up early on with this kind of saying, you know, when I'd ask my parents, what should I do for a living? You know, they'd say to me, do what you love and the money will follow. The premise being, it might sound crazy, but pursue what you love doing, pursue an interest, you know, become invested in it, become mentally and emotionally engaged in it, and the places where you'll be able to find a way to make a living will emerge from that. And really, it was a message to just shut up and stop asking her that question, probably. But this sense that maybe there's a balance to be struck there was actually pretty strong. Fast forward to 2007, and this is a graphic, and I'm sorry for the low quality, but it's the only one I could find. There was actually a print ad that had this, and it was pretty hilariously funny. This is Oracle's idea of what people want from open source, which is to take the cute, cuddly, you know, approachable kind of symbol of people working together to make something work, make a high-quality product, and gear it up like Voltron going out to do battle, and make it. You know, there's this inherent tension, I think, in the open source community today over what is it that people want, right? A lot of companies have taken the approach that what they've always been providing for big companies and banks is, you know, absolutely infallible, at least the myth is, right? Absolutely infallible, rock solid, military grade, you know, hardware and software. We know the reality is pretty different. But the approach that a lot of companies have taken has been to try to pretend like the open source, you know, what made open source successful was almost an accident, you know, that people can't really be that nice, can they, and still make money. And I'd like to think that they're wrong with that. And so part of this talk will be about how to find that synthesis between the two. Before going much further, I'd like to kind of broach the question of what does it mean to be an open source business. The words open source actually don't have much of anything to do with an economic model. Instead, technically, when they are defined as applying to a set of licenses, and we've been hearing about those, for the last 2 days. In a business, if you have to be careful how you define it. I think we sit here and agree that Red Hat probably makes a majority of its money based on open source software. IBM, sells packages called WebSphere that are combinations of open source and proprietary software. And it's hard to tell how much of it is open, how much of it is proprietary. You might even think, is a company like Google an open source company, right? Because they use Linux extensively. They have their own internal version of Linux. They have a lot of open source software they've incorporated. They do contribute, especially in the form of the Google Summer of Code. But their core business is not in improving a body of public code and informing an ecosystem around that and in promoting it. And I'd like to postulate that when I'm talking here about open source businesses, what I'm going to talk about are companies whose main method of going about their work is to interact with, to improve, and to distribute open source software. It'd be an interesting point, though, to look at Red Hat, because Red Hat does not give away everything that they build. Red Hat does keep some set of things to themselves. Their training materials, their brand, they're very, very careful about their trademark. And so I'm going to try to explore that through the rest of this presentation. One company that we might want to ask is, are they an open source company, is TiVo. How many of here know what a TiVo is? It's kind of more, it's more of an American thing, but I'm sure you have equivalents now, a set-top box that sits there and records television shows and makes them available to you. Well, TiVo's internally runs Linux, right? TiVo users never know about that. They're never told, they're not given source code to it. Because the GPL only applies in that case to the kernel and not to the TiVo applications. TiVo is not compelled to give you the source code to their application. In essence, it's very much hidden. And this is a similar model to Netgear, for example. Netgear and D-Link and a lot of the other wireless device companies out there, their home gateways are often running Linux inside. And you'd never know, right? Some people might say, though, that you look at TiVo and you see this community around TiVo of people who have added extensions to it. Because people, very enterprising and smart developers out there, have figured out how to add things like extra hard drives, how to add a web server to their TiVo, how to be able to transfer files off and do all these other interesting things, treat it like a general purpose computer. But that none of that is officially sanctioned by TiVo. It all involves working around, some protections that they've set up, and it's a constant battle back and forth. So I'd say at this point, TiVo doesn't really classify. What I do want to present the conception, though, is of companies that form around open source projects like layers of an onion, right? And that really you can think of open source projects as forming a nucleus around which at the innermost layer you have the developers, the core developers who are day-to-day working on that code, who are there either out of personal interest or they're there because their employer uses that technology and wants to contribute to it, or they're there for another reason, and I'll get to this in a sec. There's an outer layer of that onion, which are the people who are just the naive users, the people who perhaps are using a TiVo and have never heard of it, right? Never heard of Linux. Or they are people who are, using Ubuntu right now. The gap between that innermost layer and that outermost layer is where things get interesting. Because a lot of the people today who use Ubuntu are probably not going to be sitting there debating which kernel patches are the right thing to get into Feisty, right? There's gradations there of people from average users to core developers. And there's a role for companies to play. In Ubuntu's case, it would be Canonical. In other cases, and I'll go through some of them, it's other companies that help bridge that gap between that internal core developer team and the external community. And I would say it's actually a hallmark of a successful open source project that there exists a commercial ecosystem around it and a commercial ecosystem consisting not just of one player, but of a couple different players. And I'll get into that in just a bit. But it's this ecosystem that helps guarantee the longevity of an open source project. When you think about sustainability of a project, something that is like Linux or the Apache web server or other components, what is it that's going to build the confidence in people to actually use a certain technology, right? Or be willing to go through the hassle of learning how to use OpenOffice, for example. A lot of it is seeing that there is momentum, that there's this constant stream of new releases. One of my favorite metaphors is around software is to say that the general conception of software is that it's often like bars of gold sitting in a safe, and that really it's more like heads of lettuce sitting in a warehouse, right? And that over time, it degrades, and it can shift from being something that's valuable to something that is worse than useless. It's a liability. And what keeps that from happening is the constant refreshing that happens from patch-level releases, bug fixes, new versions, right? But if there's a history of a project where that goes in fits and starts, where it's somebody's kind of spare time kind of thing, or it's a classroom assignment that had a whole lot of activity, and then at the end of May it seemed to taper off, to zero. That's not going to instill the confidence in people to be willing to use a piece of open source software. And so sustainability is pretty important. And what's going to keep that sustainability going are people who are there, not just for amateur reasons, not just for hobbyist reasons. I mean, there are some very passionate, very committed people who will pour their hearts and souls into something for the long term. They are the exception. In my experience, what will keep open source projects going are when there are people who wake up in the morning and go to work, and it's their responsibility to be thinking about what's the next thing to put out for this group of people. And until we have free housing, free food, free education for all, and free airfare, people are still going to have to figure out a way to earn a living from being able to write this software. Certainly, if you have a small seed, you can amplify it with voluntary contributions and part-time contributions from a very wide community. But I've just seen, people actually get consumed in some ways by becoming this core of a set of projects. And what can help provide that sustainability are a group of companies around that perimeter providing support, providing project management, that kind of thing. Now, I actually think that there's a reason for the core group of developers who really should be independent from the companies around them, right? They might be employed by them, but the decisions they make on what's the best thing for the code base should be the decisions, that are right for the code rather than just right for their employer. But there is a role for the projects to play in helping build that ecosystem around them. This is a screenshot from the Zope project. Zope is a content management system and pretty useful piece of middleware that some of you are probably fairly familiar with. They have a couple of pages on their site that link to companies that provide support, training, consulting. They'll install Zope for you. And this is a very long list. Right now, you only see the first 4 on there. That's because I couldn't figure out how to make it small enough to list all of the over 100 different entries. But you can see by the menu on the right-hand side that it's a long list, and it was still loading actually when I took the screenshot. The reason to do this, the reason why Zope, the Zope community decided to do this was, it would provide that extra layer of users, that extra number of users for whom setting it up themselves and configuring it themselves was too much of a barrier to adoption. Right? They want the people who work for small companies or mid-sized companies to cross that leap, to make that leap and start using it, and feel assured that when there's a problem, there's an 800 number they can call, or there's an expert that they can pay for their time to come in and be a part of this. And that helps the project. That, if those contributions, those improvements, those bug fixes, even feature additions, feed a more valuable kind of application, then that's goodness all around. But there is still that line between what you give away and as what a company that's in this space needs to think about giving away versus keeping to itself. It is true there's a business model in being based purely on time, right? On, okay, I'll build this thing for you for it'll take 20 hours and I'd like, $100 an hour and let's go. That model works for a lot of software, but especially for enterprises that know what they want and have a high degree of confidence that the 20 hours is going to get them there. It works for consultancies that have established a track record. But it's, in my opinion, not enough to be able to describe the entirety of what the software industry should be about. I mentioned Red Hat. Red Hat drew that line at saying, we will invest massively in the kernel, in the desktop, in the environment, and we will sell not just, support contracts, which is the right to call us, at a certain time, but we'll also commercially sell training materials. We'll commercially sell, just like O'Reilly does with books around that. IBM made the decision at a different point, some software that they'll give away, some that they'll keep themselves. Companies in the open source space also need to be very aware of, and when thinking about what impact a company can have on or open source can have on an industry, there's a very useful book that came out over 10 years ago called The Innovator's Dilemma. How many of you have read that book? Cool. Even though, if you're engineers out there and reading a business book sounds totally boring, you should read this one. It's Clayton Christensen, and he wrote this book that looked at how disruptive change can actually, that companies that don't watch how changes happen in their industries can sometimes be led off a cliff and die disastrously. His premise is that in any given industry, at some point, there will be new players who will enter, who will have inferior products at a much lower price, and who will start providing something that initially the established players in that industry can say is totally not worthy of even paying any attention to. And that new player can change the terms. They can find a new class of users for whom that actually works. And it's easier for that new player to grow up into the established space of the existing players. It's easier for that to happen than the existing players to go downstream. One of his canonical examples was the steel industry. The steel industry used to be dominated by a couple of companies in the United States and Europe who made the full range of steel products, everything from low-grade rebar and industrial steel for building buildings and bridges and stuff, all the way to high-quality steel for surgical instruments and cutlery and things like that. And as Asia started to industrialize and introduced steel mills that used very basic technologies, they could only create the low-quality steel. But because their costs were so low, because they had new ways of making that steel, and they didn't have some of the established entrenched costs of the larger companies, they could sell it at a much lower price. And they started to win over customers and started to gradually improve the quality of the steel they were creating. And because the American and European steel mills were denying that was even a competitive threat, by the time they realized that it was too late for them to respond. And it's been disastrous for them. Open source is somewhat similar. Open source started out as being something that it was very easy for a Sun or an IBM or a Microsoft to say, oh, it's worthless. It might meet a subset of needs. It might it requires a lot of hand-holding or a lot of self-support. But it's where's the money in there, right? Who's going to answer a support question, et cetera? And people are starting to be shaken up by this. I'll talk about a bit about this later on in the presentation. But it's open source has this ability to be disruptive in any established sector of the software space. So let me talk now about, to kind of personalize a lot of these kind of themes for you and make them perhaps a bit more relevant. Let me talk a bit about the history of CollabNet, my company I started in '99, and its relationship to two open source projects that we were starting at the time, and I might even get into a third one as well. When we started in '99, it was on the premise that the tools that Apache was using, that Mozilla was using, even Linux perhaps, were designed for developers who were working in very far-flung locations to coordinate their efforts. There were tools like CVS, a revision control system, tools like a web-based issue tracker, tools like mailing lists, right? My role at Apache had actually become less one of a programmer and more one of a systems administrator, gluing these tools together, with baling wire and Scotch tape and kind of, none of them were designed to work together. They were all kind of hacky and kind of, had different concepts of who a user is and what their permissions should be, and made it difficult to build communities of projects, right, where you wanted some independence between different teams working on different things, but you wanted them to be able to look over each other's shoulder and have a common identity. CollabNet started on the premise of let's pull these together, let's add some essential glue, and take it out there and make it work. Well, adding that glue ended up being a fair amount of work. There was a lot that just didn't exist out there to manage profiles of users, the projects they were members of, to develop a pretty rich permissioning model, et cetera. And so we started to hire staff, started to build this technology, and we were putting it all out there on a site that we built that was an example of our code, actually, called tigris.org, right? And after, we weren't just dumping code there. We were building this code out in the public. And after about 3-4 months of doing this, unbeknownst to us, our VP of marketing went out and found 2 companies that were taking this body of code we had never heard of, right? Who were taking this body of code and were also taking our marketing materials. And they were erasing out CollabNet and putting their own name, right? They didn't even bother to take fresh screenshots of what they were doing. The screenshots had the little CollabNet logo in it, right? And it was an existential crisis, actually, for the company, because I was convinced that the right business model was to write all the software, put it out for free, build as large a community as we could, and that the way that we would make money was simply running that software as a managed service, right? Running these systems for other people. And my hope was that we'd build a large contributor community enough that, we'd amplify the efforts that we put in. We had 10 developers working full time, but I felt if we could put it out there in a public way, we'd get 90 people or 100 developers working very actively on it and helping us. And that we would stand out by providing the highest quality installations of these servers and building a support model that would establish us in a key place. After a lot of debate internally, both amongst executives and employees, we realized, before I say the conclusion, there's a second part to this, which is one big component of this effort was something called subversion. Up to that point, the main version control system used by open source communities had been CVS, and in many cases still is. CVS was kind of like the VW Beetle of open source version control systems. It was about 20 years old. It would break in very significant ways. It missed some key features, but when it broke, people fixed it, and hey, you got it for free, so you kind of get what you pay for. That wasn't going to work for our business. That wasn't going to be something that we could go to a big company and say, we'll hold terabytes of your data, in a system that breaks every now and then. And these key missing features were really what kept CVS from being used more widely. And so along with the rest of our tool set, we had put that out there in the open source community and had hoped to build a community around that. So at this kind of existentialist crisis point, we said, what should we do? And we decided to pull back a little bit. We pulled back from putting out the entire Tigris code base and instead focus on subversion, on making that a successful community. Because there is a critical mass, or another term from physics, an activation energy required to get a community to the point where it's actually sustaining and thriving and creating value for you. And part of that is a minimum number of developers, but part of that is enough visibility into the development process that people know where they can hook in, right? They can find, okay, here's something that needs doing, here's bugs that need fixing, here's a repeatable release process, right? And we were simply trying to boil the ocean at that point by trying to build an open source community around such a large code base. So we scaled back our ambitions and focused exclusively on the Subversion project and gave that actually time to mature. It took about 18 months from the time that we started really with a blank sheet of paper that said, build the next generation CVS. And until it got to the point where there was a prototype that could be self-hosting, where we could use a Subversion repository to manage the development of Subversion. Along the way, it was a lot of effort in finding other people who shared a need for that, encouraging them to get involved, finding ways to architect the system so there were enough layers where people could hook in and find things that they could do. And meanwhile, we developed the rest of the application, the glue and the whole connector to web-based issue tracking and mailing lists and the permissions management, did that as a separate commercial endeavor. In retrospect, I think, as painful as it was, I think it actually was the right thing to do. What we were able to do was take something I thought we'd have to sell at very much a commodity price, something that would be, we would need thousands of users or thousands of companies as our customers to turn a profit on a support model. Instead, we were able to sell to companies on the basis of about $150 per user per month. Which for some of these companies we started to get hundreds and then thousands of users. And it started to finally pay for a staff that we had of over 100 people pretty quickly, right? Meanwhile, the Subversion project, we gave it the time and the space to be able to mature. And it grew into something that today is pretty significant. Let me step through a couple of slides and show you some things. So this is the homepage of the Subversion project. It's actually hosted at subversion.tigris.org. It was very important for us to create an identity for Subversion that was independent of CollabNet, okay? Because we felt, hey, initially we might be 90% of the effort, right? We had 3 full-time developers. They all worked out of an office in Chicago, and it kind of grew to 4 and 5, actually. But they knew they had to do their work in a very transparent way to be able to be accessible to other people we'd want to involve. We also knew, though, that it might be difficult to convince other people to voluntarily contribute time to something that carried a corporate brand name. And so we launched this project, gave it its own name, gave it a sense of fairness where we said we want to lead, but we don't want to dictate. We set it up at this site, tigris.org, where there's other open source projects now, some of our own as well as it's now a home for a lot of software engineering tools. So we opened this up quite a bit. And yet, we still wanted people to know that there was a strong tie between us and the project, that we were providers of support, that we understood how we could translate, somebody's need, how to replace Rational ClearCase, for example, or AccuRev, or one of the other commercial tools out there that are competitive. We could help them work through it. And if you see, like in the upper right-hand corner, that's actually an ad banner for CollabNet's Subversion-related support services and training programs and things like that. It's animated, so I think I captured it at the wrong instant. And then on the lower left-hand side, there'll be a CollabNet logo because it's on a system that's hosted by CollabNet. Now, the result of being as transparent and open about this as possible was that the project really took off. It came to be trusted by GNOME, by KDE, by Apache. They started to replace their uses of CVS with Subversion. It gained a reputation for being of sufficient quality, and that if people found bugs, they found where they could go to report those bugs and report patches to them and all that kind of stuff. And the usage of Subversion has grown. This is a graph of public Subversion repositories, okay? Repositories that are accessible to the public internet, surveyed by Netcraft. And as you can see, the growth is pretty nonlinear. And who knows how long it'll continue like that. Maybe it's linear in the last couple of months or something like that. It's hard to tell. But the scale, though, is what's interesting. It's 100,000 public repositories. And Subversion, though, our target was to use that inside of companies. And judging from the bug reports that are logged at the Subversion website, there's probably 3 to 4 times as many private repositories as there are public repositories. Our goal had been not to completely capture all revenue from the Subversion, economy that's out there, right? All these people using it, we didn't want to turn them all necessarily into customers. Well, we'd love that, but we didn't expect that. We figured by being this open and this public and transparent about how we do things, we would have a shot at replacing CVS and ideally replacing all these other commercially expensive systems. And if only 1% of those 100,000 installations or 500,000 that they actually might represent were to become CollabNet customers, we would do so much better than we probably otherwise would have had we kept that development private, had we tried to compete against the commercial alternatives on their terms, as another commercial alternative. Because, one of the big things for me was what's the value of the trust in Subversion, right? The value, economic value of the fact that today people know that Subversion is probably not going to lose your data, right? For a company, that's really important. It would probably have cost us $20 million in marketing to get that same degree of confidence. And you'd spend that money on advertising and sending people to conferences to speak, but you'd also spend it on, getting certification from different places, on a whole lot of tests that customers could run, that kind of thing. And you'd still hope to be able to get that same degree of trust that companies like IBM and Microsoft spend hundreds of millions of dollars on. So we got that essentially for free by having the code out there, by having people around the world able to vet it. And that's become a huge economic kind of asset for us in a way. Meanwhile, this is what CollabNet's website looks like, right? We talk about Subversion. You can see a few links to it there, but it's clearly in the context of we provide, a whole bunch of different kind of services and different complete suites of which Subversion is one piece. So this is kind of just an example of kind of trying to walk that line between the two. I think what these things point to, hopefully what that example points to, and what I see a lot of out there in the open source world is kind of a new model or a new role for what companies, software companies can play. Rather than being, the home for, a whole lot of brilliant people who come up with the next major thing that no one ever thought of. Instead, I think there's a role for companies to be representatives of their customers to the developer community, right? In the Subversion example, a lot of the customers are people like HP, Dresdner, Barclays, and Siemens, banks and other IT companies who, to them, participating in an open source community to describe directly what they want or to work directly on that feels a bit esoteric. So what we did, for example, is there's a feature in Subversion that's coming in Subversion 1.5 actually called merge tracking. And this is a feature that Rational ClearCase had and a couple of other competing products. It's something we figured we'd want to get in eventually, but we didn't just want to copy the way that the existing commercial players did it. But we also knew that we wanted to better understand what that function actually was. What is merge tracking? And so we decided to spend some money to fly people from these companies, experts in change management and other things, to our offices and physically have an in-person meeting where we'd sit them down and say, tell us about how you manage your software development processes, right? How much you branch, how much you merge back, right? How long are these merges, that kind of thing. And we also brought in Carl Fogel and Mike Pilato and our other Subversion developers and had them sit there and kind of broker this conversation. A conversation that might as well have happened over email, but tapping into that kind of knowledge meant working with people in a different way, right? These weren't the kind of people who were comfortable describing how their company manages their internal development process, something they consider secret or proprietary or whatever. They're not quite comfortable talking about that on a public forum. Right? But in essence, we could act as their representatives to the developer community. We could aggregate kind of what their needs were and come up with the 20% that actually meets the 90th percentile of needs. And that's what we've done. And so we digested that. We published, kind of a whole bunch of different kind of papers and ideas. And then we worked those ideas through the Subversion community. And we didn't say, hey, this is what people tell us we need, so therefore we need it. Instead, we said, here's what we've heard people say they need, and let's see if we can match that to what other people within the Subversion community say is important. Right? So it was very much a representative democracy kind of approach. Sorry, 5 more minutes? 3 more minutes, okay. I think it also is, I think this idea that instead of companies being, software companies being the sources of innovation to instead being kind of arbitrators and aggregators, means that we're going to see the shift of power in the tech industry actually shift away a bit from the traditional software vendor kind of model, the way that IBM or even Red Hat exemplify, towards more of a systems integrator model. Do people know what systems integrators are? They're companies like Accenture and Tata Consulting Services. Sometimes outsourcers would qualify as that. These are people who probably employ the majority of developers out there who will take a software package like SAP or Oracle and build a whole lot of things around it to make it appropriate for a company, or, you know, a large company or a mid-sized company, right? They're the ones who actually make these bulky proprietary applications actually work. And in some cases, like Accenture, they employ more engineers focused on SAP than SAP themselves employ. Right? So there's a lot of knowledge of how to build applications within these companies. I think what we're going to see is that as these companies start to use open source application software rather than proprietary packages, inevitably in using it and customizing it to customers' needs, they're going to be doing things like fixing bugs, adding abstraction layers, adding web services layers, decomposing into ways that make them more flexible. And I think we might actually see them become the star examples of companies in the open source industry and major contributors to different projects, rather than what today might feel like a whole lot of investment coming from just a few companies like IBM and Sun. I think we'll also see this new role. So a lot of those companies, Accenture, Tata, Wipro, Infosys, those companies will work typically very much on spec. They'll parachute into a company, say, what is it that you need, you know, write everything down, and then do a bunch of research on what exists, and then build what's missing, right? Instead, I think we're going to see initiatives start and companies start who, instead of parachuting into just one company, try to have a view on the needs of a large number of companies and try to say, okay, and actually an example of this is something called the Collaborative Software Initiative that's being launched by Stuart Cohen of OSDL. And what he's doing is he is in communication with 5 different banks in New York who all need a certain set of software written to meet what's called Sarbanes-Oxley compliance. And this is software that each of the banks otherwise would have anticipated spending about $2 million on through an outsourcing firm or through somebody like Accenture. And what he's done is he's had enough conversations to understand here's the 20% of effort that accomplishes 90% of the needs of 6 different companies actually. And so he's gone to each of those 6 and said, give me $200,000 rather than $2 million. And I'll build this as a joint project with open source developers that I'll hire and pay from that money that I've pooled, right? So in essence, he's performing this role of a systems integrator, but for 5 or 6 different customers at once, and getting that kind of benefit of not having to build the same thing over and over again. I think we'll see this in a lot of other companies as well. And it doesn't have to be big companies and Wall Street banks and things like that. This is the kind of thing that consultancies around specific technologies like Zope could also provide, or any piece of open source software. Get to know the software really well, and then get to know the needs of a set of customers who you're very close to, right? It could be, local banking companies based in South Africa. It could be schools, right? Get to know the IT needs of a set of schools, and try to find what's that 90th percentile of functionality. And for each of them, build that extra 10% on kind of a regular time and materials basis. But, let's build a common body of code so we're not reinventing the wheel over and over again. There's another great book out there, and fortunately, this one, unlike the last one, is CC licensed, so you can go and download it. But there's a professor at MIT named Eric von Hippel, who is in the business school at MIT and has focused on this concept called user-led innovation. And this is, I think, the most interesting kind of angle on how open source businesses can really work with the open source community, but then also, make money, which is his premise is that if companies deliver their product, and it could be software, it could be anything, as a toolkit, as something that can be decomposed and worked with and remixed and such, then if the company can figure out how to incorporate those improvements back, it ends up ahead of its competitors, right? And so this book goes into a lot of examples. Open source is just one of companies that have done that. And I'd say in the example of a company like a Red Hat or a CollabNet or any of the others, if you can get really good at having that interface to your customer be one where the customer is not just a consumer, but is actively playing a role in defining the product and that you're not just listening, but you're carrying on a conversation, that's going to be a really powerful thing. 2 more slides. Don't mistake the company for the community. I got to this point about an onion and how it's good to have multiple companies around that. There are some companies out there, like Sugar CRM, who are calling themselves commercial open source companies, who have this model of saying, hey, there's an open source project and it's called Sugar CRM. There's a company and it's called Sugar CRM, and we'll build a giant community and it'll be solely attached to us, right? The problem there is that that kind of community is inherently more fragile, I think, than one that forms around something that's more independent from any individual company. Sugar CRM runs the risk of deciding to get into a new business and pissing off a set of the companies or a set of the open source developers who decided to contribute. And I think it also disincents people from becoming core, vested, active developers. And, I wish the best for them. They're a bunch of smart people that done some things very well. The license that they call open source is technically actually not open source. And so I think it's important people know that. They kind of run the boundary there. And I wish them well, and I hope they evolve, and we'll see where things go. But there's the risk of that model of community-developed software being skewed a little bit, and so. I'll skip the last point. We can get into conversations if there's any questions about it. But I just want to close with one of the things that as a company in the open source space you really don't have any choice about is you can't be seen as evil by any significant portion of your customers. When your code is open source, your customers have the right to take that code into their hands, into their own hands, and go somewhere else. It's what I called it in the last session that I spoke on, the right to fork, right? It's an inherent freedom in open source. And that means that you can't do things that proprietary software lets you do. Things like, I can't give you an open source package that's limited to only running with 10 users at any one time, right? Because you or somebody else technical can go in and change that rule that says, reject connections more than 10, and suddenly it can run for everybody, right? So when you do your product management, when you think about services you provide, you have to be thinking about how do I empower customers and empower end users through this technology rather than put them in a box and tell them that they have to spend more money to get outside of that box, right? It's a very subtle point, and the phrase actually is popularized by Google, right? And there's plenty of companies that Google either competes with or has put out of business that says, well, evil is probably relative. So it's important to keep that in mind. But I think ultimately a software industry based on a lot of the technology being open source will result in companies building products that are genuinely more about empowerment than about entrapment. So that's the big idea. And I think we've got 10 minutes for questions about. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Brian, for a very interesting first-hand presentation. We are open for questions now. I'll take hands.
And please speak into the mic so that it can be streamed successfully.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. My name's Peter Benjamin. I'm the head of a small open source company here called Cell Life that's trying to develop systems in the health sector, particularly dealing with the massive challenge in South Africa of HIV/AIDS. My question is, how do you build an open source business model that can give organizations, in our case the public health sector, the degree of confidence to do mission critical and, to put it bluntly, life-critical applications? Because in some of the meetings we go into, we say we're open source, so isn't that great? And the health information manager of different provinces, if they even understand what open source means, their reaction is, does that mean, therefore, that if there's a problem, there's no one to call, and if there's a massive problem, there's no one to sue?
So, well, I think the first thing to fight against among when people hear about the term open source is to fight the perception that changes that happen to the code base are made by anyone, right? It's actually not like Wikipedia, where, well, if anyone can change the code, how do you know what you're running? Well, the fact is that change control that happens in open source projects, that there is change management usually. That within Apache, for example, there's a standard that says if you're on a development list and you propose a patch, 3 other people have to give it a thumbs up, and no one can give it a veto, right? And that's the standard something has to meet in order to get checked in. Other companies decide to run their change management other ways, but generally it's all around keeping the quality high, right? So the first objective is how do you guarantee quality? The first thing you say is, well, here's what our change management policies are, and look at all the automated tests that we perhaps have written, right? Or here's the certifications that we've gotten. These are still things that need to be done. And some of this gets classified as marketing. I know that in one of the other questions there was a question like, well, if 75% of what we spend money on commercial software is just marketing expense, isn't that wasted? Sometimes that money is spent on, finding analysts who will look at your application and say it does the right thing, right? On getting the product certified to be used in government facilities, that kind of thing. And sometimes it's just getting the word out to build up a large number of people, because if 100 people are using your app in in production environments, the 101st is probably not going to worry nearly as much as if they're the second person to use the app. So the first thing is to really just kind of have a clear model for that, and I think the best way is to be transparent about that. So anybody could come in and audit you on that and see, well, yeah, okay, you really do have 1,000 unit tests like you say you do, right? That kind of thing. That's the biggest thing that I can think of. And the second is nothing succeeds like success. So being able to show a couple pilots, and where it's being used successfully is key. Are there other angles to that, or okay? Okay, well, I'll be around the rest of the day, so feel free to come up and say hi. Thanks.